All right, welcome everyone. Can you all hear me? Chris in the back, you can hear me? All right. My name's David Bartlett. On behalf of Susan and Chad Finer, I want to welcome you to this IRAP event, along with my wife, Jen Moyer. Thanks first to the Norwich Congregational Church for allowing us to use this space and the space in the back for a gathering afterwards. Several quick program notes. I'm going to introduce Jon Finer. He's going to have a few words, and then he will introduce Becca Heller, and Becca needs to, after that we'll have we hope, a robust Q&A session for 20 to 30 minutes, whatever we can put together, and then Becca needs to leave immediately at 5:40 in her car. She is getting a honorary degree from Dartmouth, and has shoehorned this event into her very busy weekend, so thank you. Okay, thank you. Yes. Jon will attend the less formal session and said he will stay until the very last person leaves. No honorary degree for him, yes. Jon Finer is a humble man, so I want to do a little bit of bragging for him on behalf of a proud town. Jon graduated from 3 of the most prestigious educational institutions in the entire world. I'm talking about Marion Cross School, the Richmond School, and Hanover High. I think nothing else of note educationally, right? That's it, okay. Our families knew each other from town, but I did not get to know Jon until he moved to Hong Kong in 2001 as a reporter with the Far East Economic Review. In his early reporting days there, Jon secured 2 on-field passes for a World Cup match in Macau, and he invited me as his photographer. I think I was the only accredited photographer using a disposable camera. Chad, the output you would have been disappointed with. Jon's own athletic career reached its pinnacle in 2002 when, as members of the Outback Steakhouse Blooming Onions, we won the South China Ice Hockey League championship. And I have a team picture if anyone wants to look at it later. Shortly after this, things got a bit more serious. As a Washington Post reporter, Jon was embedded with the U.S. military during the early months of the invasion of Iraq. It was dangerous work, and it involved collaboration with local journalists and local interpreters. These folks became Jon's colleagues, and they became his friends, and they also became targets of violence from various factions. Jon's early efforts to secure safe passage for these colleagues and friends is part of the origin story of Jon and Becca's founding of IRAP, which now has a much broader mandate and scope. But let's not hear about it from me. Jon, come on up.
Thank you, David, for most of that introduction, not all of it. And thanks everybody for being here. It's an amazing feeling being back on a stage that I think I was last on in 4th grade for a chorus concert with the Marion Cross School, usually somewhere far from the microphone on the side so they couldn't hear my voice. But really grateful to see so many familiar faces here. I want to start just by thanking a few people. First of all, the Norwich Congregational Church for letting us use this beautiful space, and Terry Ashley in particular for helping us secure it. I want to thank my brother Ben, who couldn't be here, for making the posters for this event. I want to thank Terry Ashley again, along with Judy Moore, Ellie Ringer, Peggy Morin, and Margaret Parsons, who spent hours at my house on Brigham Hill today making many of the sandwiches and other refreshments that we'll find in the back afterwards. So thank you for that. And then most of all, I really just want to thank my parents, Chad and Susan, to whom I owe more than I can say, and to whom I'm probably in many ways most indebted for raising us here in Norwich, an incredible place that really did influence everything in my life that came after that. And of course, Dave and Jen, my good friends. Dave stole my thunder with my story about how we met in Hong Kong in a hockey locker room of all places. But the last place you would expect to meet somebody from Norwich is often the first place you do. So a few things about growing up in the Upper Valley, and then about the topic that we're here to talk about. One of the best things about growing up in Norwich is that it is very much a small town with everything that entails, and all the positive aspects, the safety, the good schools, the reasons that people move to a place like this. But also, in my experience at least, always had a global sensibility about it. People who really did pay attention to the world and considered themselves a part of it, not people who lived off in some sacred bubble, but people who really knew that actions here and actions elsewhere were related, and cared about topics and crises that were happening all over the place. And great example of this today, while we were all making sandwiches, I was hearing about Terry Ashley's daughter Becca and the work that she's doing in Ghana, and a trip she's soon going to be taking, part of a fellowship to Oxford. These are the kinds of things that people from this town are involved in, and it was both very impressive to hear about it and also not at all surprising, having spent time in Norwich, so very gratifying to that. Obviously here to talk about a pretty depressing topic, but hopefully Becca and I together can offer you some hope in addition to the information that we're going to provide about it. We're here to talk about the refugee and migration crisis that is taking place really all around the world. It is, by all accounts, the worst in history. Nearly 70 million people, the entire equivalent to the entire population of France, have been displaced from their homes. 25 million, 28 million of those people are refugees, others displaced within their own countries. But I think what is most encouraging about a situation that is so dire, and where in many of these countries politics really are turning against refugees and against the rights that they're entitled to, is that there are actually safe ways to provide help for these people if they know how to access them. And one of the things that IRAP, the organization Becca and I founded, is most focused on is getting information about how to make this transition safely to the people who otherwise just won't have it. I got into this work, as David mentioned, as a reporter for the Washington Post. I was sent to Iraq as part of my very first assignment in 2003 at the beginning of the war, which is incredibly now almost 16 years ago, more than 16 years ago. And by 2006, when I left Iraq, the 20-plus members of our Iraqi staff were so unsafe in their own neighborhoods that they had all moved into our 3 or 4 room office. They slept on sleeping bags in a single living room every night. They did not want to go home to their families most nights because they were worried that if people knew that they were working for us, they would be endangering the people that they cared about. So they would go visit their families during the daytime and sleep in our office at night. I left Iraq in 2006 and was very concerned, obviously, about these people who I had worked with, their lives in danger, in part because they had contributed to our newspaper and to the effort that the United States had started by invading Iraq. So I entered law school and set up IRAP along with Becca, who had just had a very similar experience meeting, and she can talk more about this, meeting Iraqi refugees who had been sent to Jordan. In my mind, I set this organization up with Becca to help this small group of people who I knew. Becca had much grander visions, was an immigration law expert, an activist, and took IRAP, as I'll describe, to heights that I had never imagined. But my goals initially were much smaller. Try to get these 20-plus people out. Within a couple of years, 23 members of the Washington Post Baghdad Bureau had been resettled in the United States. That was the entirety of our staff, with the exception of 3 people. One who had ended up in Sweden, doing very well there. One who came to the United States and then returned to Iraq because he struggled to make a life here. And one, tragically, whose name I just want to mention because it was somebody I knew well, who was killed in 2007 while on the job reporting for the Washington Post. His death in 2007 was really the impetus that spurred me and others to realize that these people, if they could really, and if they were willing, needed to get out. Those 23 people are now leading incredibly productive, incredibly successful lives in the United States. Among them are an aircraft engineer for American Airlines, 3 journalists, a sheriff's deputy in Arizona, an economist at the World Bank, and 2 people who work on national security issues, of all things, born in Iraq, for the United States government in different agencies. Several of them have been to our house in Norwich for Thanksgiving in 2007. And they really are an incredible testament to what people can do if they are given the opportunity to live safe lives. So I just wanted to single them out today, and I wish that they could be here. But Becca, as she's wont to do, realized quite early that this problem was much bigger than the 20 or 30 people who I happened to know, and really took the reins of IRAP after I graduated from law school in 2009 and took it to places that I couldn't even have imagined. IRAP today, International Refugee Assistance Project, has 30 law school chapters. So what the model that IRAP uses is they use student lawyers who are overseen, law students overseen by lawyers, so they can really take advantage of the fact that students have a lot of time, but not necessarily all the expertise they need. There are now 30 of these chapters at different law schools, 120 law firms that have lawyers overseeing these cases. They have helped refugees from 73 countries, and through their direct representation of these people, trying to navigate this process, and through the policy changes that they have made, impacted 200,000 people's lives. After law school, when I worked in the US government, first at the White House and then the State Department, I really got to see firsthand how effective IRAP and particularly Becca were, because I was then on the receiving end of Becca's zealous advocacy on behalf of her clients. And the amazing thing about what they were doing is when I worked at the State Department, I had access to every bit of information the US government knew about these problems that we were working on. But the best, most concrete, most tangible, on-the-ground information that I could get about the refugee crisis, and the most creative and concrete ideas for how to address it, really did come from IRAP. And they had this information because they had these clients who were going through these very difficult, very trying circumstances in real time. And the problems that they'd encountered through the IRAP attorneys that were representing them, they could immediately bring those to the attention of the US government and try to get help. And so we found ourselves, many of us in the White House and the State Department, turning to IRAP both for ideas about how to address the crisis and relied on them to raise these issues before we would have heard about them otherwise. A few of the other accomplishments that IRAP has had in the last couple of years, because I don't want to make Becca brag about her own organization. Yeah, our own organization. Since I've now returned to IRAP as a chairman of the board, but really this is their work. I'm just happy to help facilitate it. You probably read in the wake of a travel ban that was imposed at the beginning of the Trump administration about lawyers and other volunteers descending on airports all around America. That came about in large part because Becca and IRAP realized when they had clients getting on airplanes to fly to the United States, during the period that they were in the air, the law changed under the feet of these people, and they realized that as soon as these people landed, their legal status would be completely up in the air. So it was really IRAP that built a whole network of other organizations, brought them to airports all around the country, and achieved real results. The lawsuits that they filed as a result of the travel ban, which ultimately ended up being upheld, but was amended many times and weakened during the course of these lawsuits, enabled more than 20,000 people to get into the country who otherwise would not have had access to it. These were people who were escaping, the most horrible circumstances you can imagine. Another lawsuit that IRAP has filed in the last couple of years has given access to 2,700 Central American minors who were in the process of being resettled in the United States. Just a few months ago, they achieved a legislative victory that's going to allow 16,000 Afghans who had worked alongside U.S. forces during the long war there to have visas to come to the United States. And they've succeeded in passing 10 pieces of legislation in recent years, which is a remarkable thing when you think about how little is getting done in Washington today, and that legislation requires votes from Republicans and votes from Democrats. So these really are bipartisan efforts that IRAP has helped lead to really pass things that are impacting people's lives. So I won't say anything more about it other than to introduce Becca, who really is, my mom quoted me saying this earlier today, but I'll say it again, a force of nature, the most effective leader and advocate that I've ever seen operate in this space. She's getting this honorary degree tomorrow from Dartmouth alongside such luminaries as Yo-Yo Ma, but I think all of those other recipients are very honored and should be very honored to be in Becca's company. And I'm really grateful that she was willing to be here today, so thanks very much.
Thanks for that lovely introduction. Thank you so much to our hosts. I don't want to repeat all the thank yous that John did because we have limited time before I squeeze in my other event that I have to go to tonight. I am not originally from Norwich or the Upper Valley. You made it. I was looking for you. I have a line. I was like, well, I guess if he doesn't make it, I'll cross that one out. I'm not from here originally, but I started coming here in high school to go to the Dartmouth Debate Institute, which was where all the cool kids went. And I really fell in love with the area, I think, because I was only here in July and August. I'm a native Californian, and so I came back for college. And even after I graduated, I couldn't quite manage to leave, and so I came back and lived here again for another couple of years. And while the town didn't, raise me as a child, it did really raise me as an activist. I grew up in the Bay Area, and I remember, there was homelessness everywhere. So you become aware of injustice at a very early age because you're just like, why is that person sleeping on the street? And then your, liberal, well-intended parents are like, don't worry about it. Like, it's because they won't get a job, or to try to make you feel better. And you feel in your gut that that's wrong, but you also, the world is such an overwhelming place, and the sort of social justice issues facing us can feel so overwhelming that I think often people don't realize that they actually have any agency about it. And coming here, and the ultimately 6 total years that I spent living in the Upper Valley, really showed me that I did have agency. It started out, I got to Dartmouth, and I was really interested in education. So during orientation, I tracked down some poor professor in the ed department, and I was like, I want to do something at a school. And he was like, well, there's this amazing professor, Sheila Moran, at Sharon Elementary School. Why don't you meet with her? She was like, we could really use people to mentor the kids here. So I got Donna Strange of Hanover High School to lend me her car. And I just asked a couple of people who lived in the dorm if they wanted to mentor some kids, and once a week we would all drive up to Sharon and meet with kids for, a couple of hours. And the same professor called me in 2 months later. He's like, oh, I'm so pleased with the mentoring program you started at Sharon. And I was like, the what? I just borrowed a car. And that was a pretty big aha moment for me of oh, it's not so hard. There are 2 people in the audience who also enabled my various Upper Valley exploits. My sophomore year, I don't know if you guys remember Article 19, which dealt with the Guile tract of land behind the hospital. There was a whole campaign to try to get that dedicated to affordable housing. Matt Dunn was at the Rockefeller Center at the time, and we were trying to get people to canvass in Hanover and managed to get the football team to agree to spend their community service hours doing it. But I didn't trust that they would do a good job. So I asked Matt if he knew anyone who could come train him, and he gave me Robbie Mook, whose name you guys might know. He's a Vermonter, and went on to run the campaign that beat Donald Trump in the popular vote, at least. But I first met him when he came here to train the Gamma Delta fraternity football players in how to go door to door on affordable housing. And then lastly, just to finish triangulating the room, Jack Shepard, in your ENVS 39 class, where you were prepping us all to be activisty environmental scientists and care about food security, I learned that being hungry is more complicated than just being hungry, that it depends sort of where food can come from and where it can go. And I ended up starting a project going around to local farms doing gleaning, which is where you take the sort of excess produce that either can't be sold because it can't, you predict the market incorrectly, or because more often because it's a weird shape. It's like Dr. Seuss produce. And we worked with some local caterers, and we turned it into frozen meals that then were handed out at the food pantry over at the Haven. And we got the Campus Compact National Howard Swear Award for our efforts on that project. And that also just started up with we just drove around to farms with these big bags, and we're like, do you have food that you don't need? We'll pick it up. And then started cooking it. And, these were all efforts of mixed success, I would say. But the community just really provided me with an important and supportive training ground to see that like you could see a problem and you could do something about it. And I really think that what happened with IRAP is directly related to that, because I saw a problem and then I attempted to do something about it, which is what I'll talk a little bit about now. But I'm just, I liked it so much. After I graduated, I went and lived in sub-Saharan Africa for 2 years, and then I came back, partly for a boy. That didn't work out. But I ended up doing a bunch of local politics stuff here. I worked on the Freedom to Marry campaign, and then I was really distraught when I ultimately went south to New Haven because it didn't compare, but I'm really pleased to be here today. I think that sort of that mentality directly led to my feeling that perhaps I could do something about the refugee crisis, or that as a group we could do something about the refugee crisis. As Jon mentioned, I knew nothing about the Middle East. I had no real claim to it. I was, between my first and second years in law school, I was doing an internship in Israel, in Tel Aviv, and they just didn't have enough for me to do, and I was going really crazy because I have like an OCD thing about inefficiency. And I kept hearing about all of these Iraqi refugees in Jordan and felt that as an American, I had some kind of responsibility to at least find out, how things were going for them. So I emailed everybody I could think of who might have some kind of connection, including Jon, who I had not met but knew of because he was sort of famous at the law school. Because the dean likes to brag about the fancy students that we have at the beginning of every year, and he's like, Rhodes Scholar, Washington Post, blah, blah, blah. So I remember just being super into it and being like, hi, do you know any Iraqi refugees that I could meet with? And I went to Jordan and I spent a week there and I met with 6 families. And again, I'd sort of worked on a myriad of different social justice issues, and so I anticipated, your typical humanitarian fallout. I thought people would be hungry and have poor access to housing and to education, and for a lot of people, they were still in pretty severe danger in Jordan. If you're gay, for example, and you flee Iraq, you're not that much better off in Jordan, or if you're an interreligious marriage. But what really surprised me is that everyone kind of independently that I met with identified their primary problem as essentially legal, which is that, we have these millions of displaced people all over the world, and then these systems that we've set up to deal with them are essentially trials. You have to have 4 to 7 interviews with different people who are kind of trying to see if you meet this really complicated definition of a refugee that hasn't been updated since 1951, so it's sort of badly in need of a makeover. And you have to submit, dozens of pages of paperwork, and at the end of this, someone with varying degrees of training or cultural competence, or who may be talking to you through several sets of interpreters, looks at your file and makes a decision about whether or not you and your family get to go somewhere and be safe. It's literally a life or death decision. And I was like, wow, you need an advocate, right? You're trying to navigate this crazy process and your life depends on it, and someone should advocate for you. And so I came back to school, and Jon and I finally met in person, and I thought he was someone else, which he was really offended by, I remember. And we decided to start this student group that we were going to call the Iraqi Refugee Assistance Project, because lawyers are not very creative about naming things. And Yale was like, if you want a budget to buy people pizza, you have to have a name, and so we're like, fine. And now I'm saddled with the acronym for the rest of my existence, basically, but it turned out okay. I want to tell a really brief story about how we got started, about Jon, partially to embarrass Jon, but also partially to sort of demonstrate the you have way more agency than you think thesis of this brief talk. And I got permission first. I see Stillman is patting Jon on the back to comfort him. I was really intimidated by Jon. I had no knowledge of the Middle East. Here was a guy who had spent time on the front lines in Iraq. He had a real connection to this issue. I had literally sort of wandered into it. I guess not unlike Jews in the desert 5,000 years earlier. And I really felt like a carpetbagger. I spent, the first couple of years we were doing IRAP, I was just reading all the books about Iraq that I could find, so at least I didn't sound like a complete idiot. And So John and I got together and we sort of hashed out this scheme for what we thought this would look like, and the first thing we had to do was get other students to volunteer. And so we needed to put together a table at the Student Activities Fair, and I was like, all right, I'll do the sign-up sheet and you do the poster. And John was like, how do I do a poster? And I was like, get a piece of poster board. Like, do you have any pictures of your time in Iraq? And he's like, yeah, of course. I was like, great. So write like Iraqi Refugee Assistance Project, nice and big in the middle, and then just put the photos around it. And then we got to the Student Activities Fair, and John had made, no offense, the crappiest poster I've ever seen. It said, I think it said IRAP, and it didn't say what it stood for, and then it just had like these 3 pictures like sort of sadly stuck on the bottom in the corner. And it was this crazy sort of epiphany, it's weird to use that word in a church, it was this crazy epiphany moment for me of like, oh my God, I have value add. Right? Like, I don't know what it's like how many flak jackets you need to put in the van to make sure that like you don't, when you go over an IED, you can try to be safe in the war, but like I do know how to make a poster for a Student Activities Fair. And again, like I tell that a little bit to mock John in his home community, although I tell it in other places too, but in part because like I just think that like people have no idea of their own agency. You just like never know what weird specific skills you have that you can put to use in favor of a broader movement. And I think now is a really important time for people to kind of remember that and be aware of that. You know, people ask me all the time like, well, what can I do to help? And I'm just like, what do you like doing? Like, what are you good at? You can definitely do that to help if you find the right place. So John and I get a bunch of students to start working on cases, and a couple weeks in, our supervising professor calls us into his office and he says, you guys aren't working on cases, are you? And we were like pretty dumb, but not completely dumb, so we were just like, oh, Mike, that's an interesting question, why do you ask? And he said, because that's illegal, because you're not lawyers, and that's called the unauthorized practice of law. And we're like, oh, good thing we're not doing it. And I remember standing in the hall outside of Mike's office, and John and I are just like, we gotta find some lawyers. How are we gonna do that? And then we're like, well, the private firms come here and recruit all the time. Why don't we just say like, hey, do you wanna sink your claws into some EO law students? You can supervise them on these cases and then, you know, take your best shot at getting them to come work at Paul Weiss. And it worked. And I spent the first, John tells it like I had like a very clear vision from jump, but I really didn't, and I had no real interest in starting an organization. We spent the first year just trying to figure out like who else is doing this, so we could just volunteer for them, which is my like efficiency tick again, but also just like, all right, let's figure this out, and then I can go back and take the immigration legal aid job that I had always intended to take, and we couldn't find anyone. And a year later, I was doing an internship at the New York Legal Aid Society. And I'm like sharing a cubicle with 87 other law students. And I get a call on my cell phone from this guy, Vince Cochetel, who is the head of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees for North America. And like every culture has their little like sub-celebrities. Like maybe you're one here, I don't know. Sorry, I can stop. It's too easy. So in the world of refugee advocacy, Vince Cochetel is like the man. He's currently trying to solve like the entire central Mediterranean crisis for migrants. He did an amazing TED Talk about how you keep yourself sane when you're being held hostage in Chechnya for 180 days that some of you may have listened to, but you definitely should. And he somehow got my cell phone number, and he called me up and he said, I heard that you and some other law students are working on these cases for refugees, and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has cases that we'd like to refer to you. These are cases that we've vetted extensively and we've referred to the US, but the US has rejected them, and there's no system for them to appeal. So we thought maybe you guys could put together some appeals. And I have this like completely bifurcated reaction of, on the one hand, like, oh my God, Vince Cochetel is calling me. And then on the other hand, like, oh my God, like, I shouldn't say that here at this pulpit either. Sorry, I don't speak in churches that much. And on the other hand, like, oh my goodness, like you don't have anyone else to call. Like there's no one else who like can actually, for example, authorizedly practice law that you can call. And that was when I kind of decided to pull the trigger and try to start doing this full time when I graduated. So we created this model where we said, okay, when we utilize these law firms and these law students from all these different chapters, we can really leverage something we can bring to scale for not that much money, because all the time and the resources on the cases are donated. So we can walk through this system, a couple thousand times every year, and we're learning all this crazy stuff. What do we do with that information that can actually have a systemic change? So we created an advocacy department, which was also sort of part of our original vision, but it took us a while to figure out what that should look like. And that's how we ended up on the other end of sort of firing at the State Department. But our whole model is basically based on this idea that it should be an interdisciplinary approach, that by doing the direct legal aid work, we're helping people directly, but we can also sort of help people and have our cake and eat it too by taking what we learn and using that to affect broader systemic change, because oftentimes when you have these individual legal cases, you see things before anyone else sees them. This happened pretty directly on January 27th, 2017. So Donald Trump gets elected president. He's made a series of promises about banning Syrian refugees, about trying to keep Muslims out of the country generally. He said a lot of pretty intense anti-immigrant stuff. And we had spent a few months just being like, okay, we understand there's going to be a lower number of refugees, but what can we do about it? Like, what resources do we have to fight this? And we're like, well, we have like 2,000 lawyers and law students, so let's brainstorm how that can be helpful. Then the first Monday of the presidency, a version of the Muslim ban is leaked to us. Someone took a photo of a desktop monitor in the White House with the text of the ban on it, and sent it around. And we're like, oh, so this is happening now. So we call all of our clients, and we had a lot of clients who had valid permission to enter the US but hadn't left yet, because when you're trying to sort of end your entire existence and start somewhere else, it takes a really long time. Like, I have a 3.5-year-old, and just packing for a 3-day weekend up here took us, hours and hours and hours. So you can imagine if you're trying to liquidate everything you own and bring your whole family. And so we had to make all these phone calls that were just like, it's now or never. The doors to the US are closing, and you need to get on a plane and come in, because we don't know if they're going to open again. And so throughout that week, we had clients of ours who were just sort of flying in on airplanes to the airports. And that Wednesday, we had a transgender client flying into LAX. And with transgender clients, travel is always really tricky, because their identity doesn't match their identity documents. Right? Because if you're in, for example, Saudi Arabia, and you're born as Jon, and then when you're 12 you realize that actually you're Becca, and you start living your life as Becca, you cannot go to the Saudi Arabian government and say, oh, by the way, I'm Becca, I'm a woman now, can I please have a new passport? Because they'll literally kill you. So we always worry about transgender clients on exiting, but this time I was really nervous about entering, because I was like, if this travel ban comes down, they're going to be looking for any excuse to mess with this woman, and we don't know what's going to happen. So we sort of surreptitiously had a local lawyer go wait in the arrivals area of LAX, and he was WhatsApping with this woman, and luckily the ban didn't come down while she was in the air, and she made it through. That night I'm G-chatting with our policy director, and she's like, oh, thank goodness the ban didn't come down today. And I said, oh, why? Was it because this woman was able to come in? And Betsy was like, yeah, and also all the other people on that plane. And I was like, oh my gosh, at any given time, this thing is going to come down, and there's going to be thousands of people mid-air who, when they took off, had legal permission to enter the United States, and then are going to land as undocumented immigrants, and no one knows what's going to happen to them. So we start organizing lawyers to go to airports. But still sort of no one knows what's going on. The ban is ultimately signed at 4:30 p.m. on Friday, January 27th. And everything seems really chill for about 3 hours. And then we find out that one of our clients, Hamid Darwish, has been detained at JFK. And Hamid worked for 10.5 years as an interpreter on a forward operating base in Iraq, which means a lot of things. It means that he spent a decade putting his life on the line for the US. It also means that he went through 21 military grade level security checks, because when you work on a FOB, you have to have a military grade level security check every 6 months. He landed with his wife and his 2 kids, and was determined by the executive order to be a national security threat and shackled to a table. And we found out because his wife and kids came out crying to meet their lawyers, and they said, Hamid is locked up. There's a bunch of other people locked up with him. We don't know how many. And that was the first person that anyone in the country knew had been detained under the travel ban. And we were able to use that. We stayed up all night putting together a lawsuit with a number of other organizations, including the ACLU, my old professor Mike at Yale Law School, who I still call when I'm trying to figure out how to do anything at all. And we filed it at 5:30 in the morning because we wanted it on file before any international flights could take off, so they couldn't deport anybody back to a place where they might get killed. We had argument at 7:30 the next night, and at 8:30 that night, so 24 hours after the initial ban came down, we had won an order freeing 2,100 people who were being illegally detained at airports all over the country. And that was a turning point because I realized that we were going to need to open a litigation shop because we didn't have people like Finer working in the administration anymore. So probably when we wanted things to change, we were going to have to go to court. So over the past 2 years, we've been suing over a bunch of things. We've had a lot of really good successes. There's a program for Iranian religious minorities that the administration tried to shut down. They can't close it totally because it's mandated by Congress, so instead they just rejected every single person in it as a national security threat at the same time. We won a lawsuit reopening that, and those families are continuing to arrive. We also most recently, as John mentioned, won a lawsuit on behalf of 2,700 children who were in Central America and were separated from their parents. And their parents were in the States, and all 2,714 of them now can legally come to the US. They can get on a plane in Tegucigalpa and land in Chicago instead of having to get smuggled through the Sonora Desert and across a border. And I think that what we're trying to remind people of now is that no one leaves home if they have any other choice. There's an amazing poem called Home by a British Somali poet named Warsan Shira, and there's a line that says, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark, right? I don't think there's really any such thing as a voluntary migrant. The same way that you wouldn't want to leave your community here unless it turned into the mouth of a shark and you couldn't stay anymore. And the people who are leaving home don't want to be crossing into other countries illegally, but if they don't know what their legal options are, or clear legal pathways aren't made available, then they also don't have any other choice. There's another line in that poem that says, no one puts their child in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. And to illustrate the sort of real world impact of that, the UN again approached us a couple of months ago, and they said, we have tens of thousands of unaccompanied kids throughout Northern Africa. They're from Sub-Saharan Africa, they're from the Middle East. They're all in Northern Africa because they're there trying to get on rafts across the Mediterranean. And the reason they're doing that is because their parents made it into Europe during the big kind of migration flows of 2016 and 2017. These kids and their parents don't know that they can legally enter Europe if they just get a lawyer to do the paperwork for them. So the UN came to us and they said, we will pay you to do these cases so that these 10,000 kids can get on planes instead of on boats. And we're launching that pilot in like a month, which is kind of overwhelming. But it's a really exciting thing to see sort of global institutions coming to terms with the fact that like this is a legal problem. Because I think most people, if you went to them and you said there are 65 million refugees in the world, what do they need? The answer would not be like, oh, a lawyer, obviously. But I think the real kind of long-term solution for people, if no country will claim them, is to find a country that will give them legal status where they can rebuild their lives and start over. And when we hear things like there are 65 million refugees, it can feel really overwhelming. And it takes me back to when I felt sort of overwhelmed by the general injustice of things like homelessness and where do you even start? And how, in the face of something so big, how do you take any action that seems meaningful? But then you think about it and you're like, okay, every single one of those 65 million people, like they're not a block, right? Each of them is an individual and they have a name and they have a mom. And if we can do one at a time, right, or 10 at a time or 10,000 at a time, that's enough to make a really serious difference in the lives of a huge number of people, and then to try to also get the system to change so that other people can follow behind in the paths that you create. So I just want to conclude by sort of saying that, you know, in the 10 years I've been working on this, and especially in the last 2, when it's felt kind of at its most hopeless, the thing that has kept me going, and the thing that I just hope people in the room will take away, is that I have agency, and you have agency. And even in the face of the overwhelming issues that we're dealing with right now, people keep standing up and saying, this is un-American, these are not American values, we're not gonna let this happen here. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to remind people that this is a country of immigrants, that refugees are not terrorists, they're also not victims who are in desperate need of our help. They are some of the most like tenacious, entrepreneurial, badass people I've ever met. Like just you try getting your family out of ISIS-occupied Mosul and then coming to the US and starting everything over. Like these are the people that we want in this country, and we should be competing for them, not having a race to the bottom to keep them out. So I hope that folks in this room will feel compelled to join our work in some way. There's a myriad of ways to do that. But at the very least, whatever your issue is, and whatever you're trying to stand up for, that you don't let kind of the slog of daily media and current events prevent you from continuing to exercise your agency to try to make positive change. Thank you very much.
So I think we have about 20 minutes, is that right?
Becca has about 20 minutes.
20 minutes.
And if you have any questions or comments, microphone, or you can speak loud.
I'm loud. Could you talk about the ways to get involved in your work, especially for those who don't have a legal background?
Yes. You can give us money. That is the most useful way for you to get involved, to be honest, right now. We also have on our website, you can sign up for action alerts. You can sign up for our newsletter, which is like a lot of propaganda, which is a fun way to keep up with what we're doing. But for, you know, a more kind of like vectored activist-y approach, we have an action alerts system, email, something with technology, so that like when there's an important law that Congress is voting on, or when the administration is considering something, we'll shoot something to you saying, you know, here's what you can do, here's what's helpful. Also, if you speak another language fluently, you don't have to be a lawyer to be really, really helpful to us. For example, like it used to just be Arabic, but now with these 2,700 kids, like we're running a hotline because now someone actually has to like get them on all the planes. And we have like a 300 call backlog. So if you are a fluent Spanish speaker and are interested in helping with that, we could definitely use you. But there's a section of our website called Hope and Help, which posts sort of current volunteer opportunities. And you can check in on that as well.
And there's a bunch of material in the back for people that want more information, paper, that's what.
And the money does what? Tell us what the money does.
Well, we're a nonprofit organization, so in the broadest sense, it allows us to exist. But the way that it maths out is essentially having one staff attorney costs us about $100,000. And one staff attorney can monitor about 50 cases. We have an average of 5 people on a case. So that's 250 people that come to safety. And that's done through a team of every case has a minimum of 2 law students and 2 lawyers. So it simultaneously trains 200 law students and lawyers at law schools around the country and the top law firms to become refugee advocates. Then that says nothing of sort of what we find when we do the 50 cases that we can then elevate to a legislative level or a litigation level. But we're, we're getting, way more requests for help than we can possibly field right now. So we're just really trying to, we feel like we have a proven model. We win 85% of the cases that we bring that get resolved. We've won 100% of our lawsuits, although that will not continue, I think. But that, we're trying to go to scale and help as many people as we can. And to do that, we have to fundraise in order to hire staff.
Anybody else?
Mary?
Rebecca, thank you very much. It's really inspiring. And I want to ask you, what was your undergraduate degree? You said a little bit about when you were an undergraduate, but what was your undergraduate major and or minor, and how, if at all, was it influential beyond what you already said?
Directly, because I didn't have one, because Dartmouth has a program called Senior Fellowships, where your whole senior year, instead of making you have a major or take any classes, they just give you a grant to do work, and then they graduate you. So I did that, and my senior fellowship was around community gardens as a response to HIV-related malnutrition in Zimbabwe, which I blame you for. Directly for sending me and Sally there in the summer of 2004 with medical supplies. Well, I think we brought us back. And then I minored in like pretty much everything. I think I had a minor in like education policy, environmental science, and poli-sci or something.
You talked about the system being archaic and you're hoping for an overhaul bit by bit. I know this is a big question, but would you talk a little bit about what you think our policy should be in 10 years?
In 10 years?
Immigration.
I guess I should speak to refugees specifically, because if I speak to immigration broadly, we'll be here all night. I don't think we should have a ceiling on the number of refugees we let in. I think we should process people as fast as we can, dedicate a lot of resources to doing the processing, to making sure we're doing it right and that people are being vetted, and then bring in as many people as possible. Right now we operate under a cap system, where the highest number that we were supposed to have was the final year of the Obama administration, which was going to be 110,000, which I think is a really pathetic number. I think that for a country of immigrants who came in and killed everyone who was living here in order to take over a 3,000-mile swath of land, that creates a lot of obligations to let in other people who are fleeing persecution and death, and I think that's particularly true for places where we've created the persecution and death. So like for all the migrants coming up from Central America right now, because we exported MS-13 to El Salvador and made it unlivable, and then in the last 6 months cut off all humanitarian aid to those 3 countries, I think we should be letting a lot more people in, and I think we should be devoting resources to doing that, and also recognizing that that will benefit our economy. Like there's been numerous studies demonstrating the benefit of refugees and immigrants to the economy. My favorite is one that the Trump administration ordered itself to do. In the Muslim ban, they said that there had to be a study on how much admitting refugees costs the US every year, on the assumption that they would have a really good talking point coming out of it for why we shouldn't let any refugees in. And the administration's own study that they then tried to bury and was leaked to the New York Times found that over a 10-year period, refugees netted $64 billion to the US economy.
So I think it's also, from the perspective of somebody who's been in the government, worth mentioning something about security, because that's usually a question that comes up in these contexts. And I think the 2 things that are most important, because I think people rightly worry about this, and governments consider it their most important priority to keep people safe, and should. One, this is the most heavily vetted population of immigrants anywhere in the world, but certainly of any immigrant population that comes into the United States.
Or of any citizens. None of you have been vetted this way.
Exactly. So an extraordinary amount of time, energy, and resources are spent making sure that these people are not a threat to the United States. And the best evidence of that is the fact that the rate of crime or terrorism or any other sort of negative effect that you could study, and it all has been studied, among the refugee population is incredibly low, lower than the general population of American citizens. So the program works, the vetting program works. And so people do worry about this, understandable why they do, but the results sort of speak for themselves.
My favorite statistic weirdly comes from the Cato Institute, and it's that you're twice as likely to be struck by lightning as to experience violence at the hands of a refugee.
So is somebody in your organization working with the Senate, or does the Senate show any interest in talking to you? And perhaps to
Yeah, we have a whole policy advocacy arm, and by whole arm I mean 3 people, which is why we ask for money all the time. And we've passed 10 bills. The bills that Jon mentioned were all federal bills. They went through both houses. 2 of them were actually unanimous. One of them passed unanimously during the 2014 government shutdown by a voice vote. And those are mostly around the issues facing U.S. allies in Iraq and Afghanistan, because we feel like that's a really good way to bring players from both parties to the table, to show that there are real national security impacts of our immigration policy, and that if we don't take care of our allies in the current wars, we're not really going to have any in the future. And so, for example, like John McCain was a huge champion of ours in the Senate, and Lindsey Graham has sort of picked up that mantle, I think, in his stead. But we've made a lot of efforts to, I think opposing the president's immigration policies, to me, is no longer partisan. It's just American. And there are a number of Republican senators and representatives who I think also see it that way, who we've been able to work with.
How many would you say?
Enough to pass legislation, and it varies every time, usually, like the 6 that you really need.
What have you seen, you've been doing this for a few years, progression of people that do get here and are here legally because of your efforts, their progression into eventual employment, housing, resettlement, and maybe there are other agencies to take over at that point?
Yeah, there's a pretty developed system of, once you get here, you actually get a lot of stuff. If you read the actual law about refugees, there's a paragraph about how they get admitted, and then 20 pages about what happens after they get here, and what kind of things they're entitled to. Obviously it's really challenging, and some people have more success than others. But I think Jon gave a pretty good example of in a not quite random sampling of 23 people, where a lot of those folks ended up. And I have a client who, we got her in 2014. She had actually originally been rejected. She was a human rights activist for women in Iraq, and specifically for Assyrian Christian women, and was being targeted for that, and had received commendations from the US State Department for her work. And then when she applied to be a refugee, she got rejected. And she got rejected under a provision of immigration law that says if you've been convicted of a crime, you can't come into the US. And the crime that she was convicted of was that she was, in the late 90s, so about 15, 20 years before this, she had been kidnapped, forced to marry someone who had repeatedly assaulted her for a month until her brother was able to rescue her. Then he sued her for alimony and won. She won on appeal, and it should have been expunged. So there wasn't even a criminal conviction, but the one that existed was that she should be paying money to the guy who had
Unpaid alimony.
Right, unpaid alimony to the guy who kidnapped her and just abused her in the most horrible ways repeatedly for a month and a half. And we appealed, and it actually took an op-ed in the Washington Post to get a good ruling on the appeal, because people are so afraid of these cases. And she graduated from law school on May 18th. Which is amazing. And it's just it's a self-selecting group, right? It's people who go through really horrible things, and then we call it voting with their feet. They get themselves out, and they come here and they want to start over. So I think the sort of resettlement prospects for, and I don't want to say integration, because I don't think they should have to integrate if they don't want to, but the renewal and resettlement prospects for refugees are unbelievably bright, given who selects into the process by escaping in the first place.
You mentioned that people don't leave unless, they're in the mouth of a shark, I think. So I suspect you really have a view on what life is like in the places people are coming from, in addition, in all this work you're doing. And is that also something you work with? Or?
Conditions on the ground?
Yeah, why people are leaving, and because that's the root, right?
Yeah, we don't really. And we think about that a lot, that are we solving the root cause of this problem? And I think it depends on how you conceptualize of the problem. I do not feel that my pretty small NGO is in a position to like solve the Syrian civil war. What I do feel we're in a position to do is try to affect U.S. attitudes towards people fleeing the Syrian civil war. So I think we conceptualize of the problem we're trying to solve as the attitude by destination countries about whether or not and how refugees should be able to come in, recognizing that I think human flight is going to be inevitable, and most of the human flight that we're going to see in the next, 5 to 50 years is going to be from climate change. Places are going to become unlivable because there isn't going to be water, it's going to be too hot, there's going to be disease, and those people are going to need to go somewhere. And someone's going to have to make sure that they have a way to do that.
And to Becca's point earlier about the age of the refugee definition, 1951,
Yeah.
would not encompass people who flee their country of origin because of climate. That was not something that was envisioned when that definition was drawn up, and if those people are going to be entitled to the same rights as people who flee conflict, that will all have to be reconceptualized by the world.
Related to that question, how do you think about ramping up for patterns that you're seeing happen that aren't necessarily on our border yet, like a Venezuela to Colombia, or something we're seeing happen in the world that is obviously going to end up being an issue for us, for you? How do you think about that? I know you have a small team, but is that something you...
Yeah, I mean, so we have to pick and choose pretty carefully because we're pretty small. I mean, just to give a comparison, like our whole budget is about $6.5 million, and the International Rescue Committee's budget is $800 million. So what I'm really interested in is gaps. And that's not to say that like various refugee crises have been sort of saturated with NGOs helping them. But like we just started programming in Greece in the last year because everyone else left. The European community funding dried up. So all the NGOs that had sort of flooded in the first couple of years and been on all the islands helping people no longer felt that it was profitable or sustainable to be there. And then we were like, okay, time for us to go in. Because now there's no one there like doing this work. And we started the pilot there in October, and we've already gotten out 150 kids who have been reunited with their parents in Germany. We're working specifically on the Greece to Germany pipeline. And we've won 4 lawsuits about the way that Germany implements this program, which has made us very popular. But I think, with like Venezuela and Colombia, like, yeah, I'd love to be able to do something there, but I think for us it's about saying like, where's there a legal issue specifically, where is there a gap, and then how do we sort of stage our intervention there in the most effective way possible, and we do have to pick and choose.
Jon, I'm just wondering from your standpoint, from a political standpoint, how simplistic is it to say that just a change in power from the Republicans and the Democrats is going to solve these problems?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's obviously not the case, right? So at the end of the Obama administration, the number of refugees being admitted was like on the order of 70,000, I think in 2015, maybe 100,000 in 2016, and we're talking about 65 million people who have been forced from their homes. So at the end of the day, resettlement is going to make a huge difference in those people's lives, so I don't want to minimize it. But on the scale of the problem, it is not going to be the end of the refugee crisis by any stretch of the imagination, just if there's a change in U.S. administration. I mean, it really gets back to this question of underlying causes. I mean, I spent some of my time when I was in the government working on the refugee issues, mainly when Becca called. I spent a ton of my time trying to figure out a way to end the Syria civil war with my boss, who was John Kerry. We didn't succeed in doing that, and that's still going on now. We're 8-9 years in. These war and peace issues at the end of the day, and the drivers of those are going to be what people have to get their minds around to actually solve the problem. But I do want to again not leave the impression that there's a minimal change here. I mean, for the difference of 50 or 60,000 people's lives who are admitted to the country or who are stuck in the conditions where they're currently living. I mean, this is everything.
Resettlement also has a lot of kind of political potential. I think both here, like once people arrive, and you hear about like, oh, here's these 2 people who came in as Iraqi refugees who are contributing to our national security prospects. Or even just like when they come into sort of small communities in say like purple states, where people maybe think they don't like refugees just because they haven't met them, the way that like my own grandmother felt about various populations that I won't name. Like she's like, oh, these people, but like I like the ones I know, you know? I think if you bring in 70,000 people every year and they settle throughout the US and people see that they're just people, right? I mean, I don't want to do the like Us Magazine refugees, they're just like us, because I think they're kind of a little better based on what they've had to go through. But there's a real political impact to that in terms of like changing the attitude of xenophobia that I think has seized us in Europe. The other way that it plays out politically is that the US has often been able to use resettlement to get frontline countries like Jordan or Turkey or Lebanon to agree to provide like the right to work for certain refugees. So the US government will go to the Jordanian government and say, if you keep the border open between Jordan and Syria, we'll probably give you a bunch of military aid on the side, that's your part, not my part. But at the same time, they'll say, and we'll agree to resettle like 20,000 refugees out of here. And then as a result, hundreds of thousands more are able to come into Zatri camp from over Syria and be safe. So there's a lot of smart ways to leverage resettlement as a way to really impact sort of global politics overall.
I think the better question in some ways is why has this become a partisan issue at all? This is one area of kind of foreign policy that never traditionally was. I mean, we've fought a lot about immigration, we've fought a lot about other things, but the refugee population was always somewhat protected, insulated from these kind of partisan fights, and that's no longer the case. And I think that says a lot more about ways in which our country has changed than anything it says at all about the people who we're trying to help. Yep.
How does the U.S. Compare to other developed countries in terms of sharing the burden of the refugee crisis?
So Becca will know the numbers historically quite well.
We used to take more than twice as many as every other country combined prior to 2017, and now we're about on par with places like, this year we're going to take in probably 20 to 25,000. It's about the same number that Canada and the UK are going to take in.
But what's a little misleading about this is, the countries that actually have the most refugees in them did not agree to take these people. Like
right.
Turkey has a million plus Syrians that came across their border, not because they said, we want to resettle these people, but because they just arrived. Lebanon, which has a population of only a few million, has another 700,000 or 800,000 Syrians living in it. I mean, we're talking about almost 1 in 3 or half of their population is now refugees from other places. Jordan, similar situation. So
these aren't developed countries, though. We're talking about first world countries like Australia, Canada, Sweden. I mean, how do we compare proportions?
Sweden's actually quite good.
We're about the same now, and we used to be much, 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 much higher.
Do you feel our burden is heavier than theirs because we've created a lot of problems?
I think if you invade somewhere and a lot of people get like persecuted as a result, probably you should try to help them.
And
what's your vetting process in the cases that you take, and what percentage of the cases that you receive are you able to take on?
Sure, so there's different outcomes for cases that we vet. Some cases we take on for full legal representation, that's probably 5 to 10%, but a lot of cases we're able to just provide limited assistance and say, you just need to send this form to this email address. And we've built a robot now that can do that, which is sort of, I guess they call it like a chat bot, that we're
software, it's not like a little guy.
Well, I think there's a little guy in the computer, right? Isn't that how that works? This is clearly not my area, but we've managed to automate a fair amount of it, so we're hoping that we can continue to sort of provide like a tailored independent response to anyone who contacts us. But our vetting process for when to like take on someone's case is pretty intense. We have caseworkers who do first-line reviews. We gather all their documents. Then every case is reviewed by an attorney, and then either our deputy legal director or our legal director before we take it on. Once we have kind of all the documents and the full narrative in place.
Are you working to make the waivers for nationals affected by the Muslim travel ban more transparent and normalized?
We're working on the waivers. It would be a gross overstatement to say that we were making progress on the system. We've won a number of individual waivers, and the process has been really insane. As you might know, only 6% of people applying for waivers under the Muslim ban have been granted them. which is bonkers, because the waiver categories are like really like you need to come here for life-saving medical treatment, like you need to come here because your U.S. citizen kid is getting life-saving medical treatment, right? It's a pretty serious set of categories to begin with. So we're starting to look at sort of what advocacy or litigation moves we might have. I got contacted like 4 days ago by someone who runs a program I had never heard of that gets Syrian refugee students into like top colleges, and they have a dozen students who have been admitted to like MIT, Harvard. Dartmouth wasn't on the list for some reason. And the students can't get the visa waivers, and they have full scholarships. So, you know, it's definitely an area that needs more work and that we've started to work on, but we haven't made systemic progress on it. We would like to.
You mentioned just at the end that you thought that you weren't going to win so many of your lawsuits. Now you had a good track record. What are the biggest legal challenges in the courts that are?
Oh, I think we'll still win most of them, but just like no one, like the fact that we've won all of them is insane. And I asked our litigation director is this woman Mariko, because when we first got involved in litigation, I had some real problems with sort of like the gender and race play out of the litigation field. So we hired this really amazing woman of color to run our litigation shop. And I asked her actually a few weeks ago, I was like, so is this IRAP, is this luck, or like, have you ever lost a case? And she's like, no, I've never lost a case. And I'm like, well, I don't want to be there when you do. But I just mean like, it's very unusual for a litigation shop to win 100% of its cases. So I like to brag about it, but I also like to sort of not mark that out as the standard that we're anticipating meeting going forward. But it's not because there's a particular like institutional reason why I think we might start losing.
Are you starting to see an impact from the more conservative justices that are being confirmed by the Senate?
It just means we have to file all of our cases in California. Yeah, I mean, it didn't go that well when the Muslim ban went to the Supreme Court. But that was, you know, I guess that was post-Gorsuch and pre-Kavanaugh. And we lost Roberts, so we wouldn't have won anyway. But, you know, I think if you can kind of stay out of the, like, you just have to be sort of smart about where you file. I think we probably have time for like one more question.
So you're running an NGO, and I'm wondering to what degree you're getting foundation support?
To a pretty good degree. I think about 50% of our money is from foundations, not including the foundations that are just like someone's family foundation, because we count that as individual gifts. It definitely was a little bit of a slog at first, because I think the trendy thing for foundations now is to fund in like really specific defined buckets, because that feels more strategic. And so when you're doing a thing that no one has done before, you don't fit in a bucket. And then you have to like be around for a really long time and like get a profile in the New York Times before they'll take a meeting with you. But then sometimes once that happens, a lot of doors open.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Becca's off to have dinner with Yo-Yo Ma. Jon will join us in the back room for some snacks and drinks. Thank you.
Sorry, what was the question?
I'm just trying to turn this thing off. I think Chipper knows how to do it.
Yeah, he does. I'll speak to him.